The moment an alien queen recognized my voice, an entire empire nearly changed course. The diplomatic shuttle vibrated softly as it descended through the violet clouds of Alara Prime, the capital world of the Solarian Dominion, and Ethan Walker watched the alien skyline grow larger through the cockpit glass, a forest of luminous towers stretching miles into the sky like blades of crystal reflecting the pale light of a distant sun. He had been a Marine once, the kind who measured risk in footsteps and seconds, but today he carried no rifle, no armor, only a simple envoy's coat, and the quiet weight of a decision that might determine whether billions of lives would wake up to another morning. The airlock hissed open and cold perfumed air flowed into the shuttle, carrying faint scents of ionized metal and something floral he couldn't name, and beyond the landing platform stood 2 lines of towering alien guards with cobalt blue skin and polished armor that gleamed like liquid chrome under the white lights. None of them spoke as Ethan stepped forward, his boots echoing softly against the marble floor, the sound strangely small inside the vast alien palace. The throne hall stretched farther than a football field, its ceiling rising nearly 200 feet overhead where transparent panels revealed the slow drift of alien stars, and along the walls stood hundreds of silent observers, generals, scholars, advisors, each one watching the lone human walk toward the center of their empire. At the far end of the hall, a throne carved from a single piece of black crystal stood on a raised platform 30 feet high, and seated upon it was Queen Alara herself, her presence so still and composed it felt less like seeing a ruler and more like standing before a force of nature. Her skin carried the deep royal blue of polished sapphire, her silver hair falling like liquid metal over her shoulders, and when her golden eyes settled on Ethan, he felt the weight of an entire civilization measuring him in silence. A translator drone hovered quietly near his shoulder, but the queen spoke first in flawless English, her voice smooth and distant like wind over ice. Human envoy, you have 1 minute to explain why your species deserves peace. Ethan inhaled slowly, feeling the cool marble beneath his boots and the attention of every alien in the room tightening around him, like gravity, and for a moment he thought about the brief message he had received before leaving Earth. No threats, no instructions, just a quiet reminder from an old admiral. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is speak instead of fight. So Ethan Walker lifted his head and began to speak, his voice calm despite the pounding of his heart, explaining why war would destroy more than territory, why 2 young civilizations standing at the edge of the galaxy should choose curiosity over fear. And the moment the first full sentence left his mouth, something impossible happened. Queen Alara suddenly went completely still. The subtle movement of her fingers stopped, her golden eyes widened slightly, and a whisper of confusion rippled through the enormous chamber as the most powerful ruler in this sector of space leaned forward on her throne with an expression that did not belong to a queen, but to someone searching their memory for something half-forgotten. Ethan finished the sentence, and the silence that followed was so complete he could hear the faint hum of the palace energy grid beneath the floor. Then the queen spoke again, but this time the cold authority in her voice had vanished, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. She stared directly at him and said quietly, almost to herself, "That voice, it cannot be." The silence that followed the queen's whisper spread across the throne hall like a sudden change in gravity, and Ethan Walker felt every pair of alien eyes shift between him and the throne 30 feet above the floor, as if the entire court had forgotten how to breathe. Queen Alara remained leaning forward, her golden gaze locked on him with an intensity that no longer resembled the calm authority she had shown moments earlier, but something far more personal, almost uncertain, and the faint glow of the chamber lights reflected across her cobalt blue skin as if the palace itself were waiting for her next word. Ethan stood still in the center of the vast hall, the polished marble beneath his boots cool and smooth, and he forced himself to remain steady even though nothing in his diplomatic briefing had prepared him for a reaction like this. The Solarian Dominion was known for precision and control, their rulers trained from childhood to display emotion only when it served a purpose. Yet, the queen on the throne now looked like someone who had just glimpsed a ghost. A murmur rippled quietly among the rows of alien advisors lining the chamber walls, and one of the armored commanders stepped forward, his silver armor catching the light as he spoke in a deep, careful tone directed toward the throne, asking whether the envoy should continue the negotiation or be escorted out while the court prepared for formal deliberation. The queen did not answer him. Her eyes never left Ethan. Instead, she slowly rose from the black crystal throne, and the movement alone sent another wave of quiet tension through the chamber, because rulers of the Dominion did not stand during negotiations unless something unexpected had changed the situation entirely. Ethan noticed the way the translator drone beside him adjusted its position, softly humming as it recalibrated, and he realized the room had grown colder. Or perhaps it was simply the strange stillness pressing against his senses. Queen Alara descended the first step of the platform, then the second, each movement graceful but deliberate, until she stood several feet lower than before, closer to the level of the hall. And when she spoke again, her voice carried across the enormous space with surprising softness. She asked him a question that did not sound like politics at all, asking him if he had ever served on a remote frontier world called Carthos 9. The name struck Ethan like a distant echo he had not heard in years, and for a brief moment, he saw the memory in fragments. Endless white ice fields under a pale sun, the quiet wind moving across frozen ridges, the lonely outpost where a handful of human marines had once rotated through routine patrol duty far from any major colony. He answered honestly that he had served there for a short deployment nearly 8 years earlier, and that it had been one of the most isolated assignments of his career. Another whisper moved through the alien court, and the queen took another slow step forward, her expression shifting from disbelief to something more focused, as though pieces of an old puzzle were falling into place. Ethan could not understand why a distant outpost assignment would matter to the ruler of a vast alien empire, yet the moment he finished speaking, the queen closed her eyes for a brief second, and when they opened again, the uncertainty had deepened into recognition. Somewhere behind Ethan, a metallic staff tapped lightly against the floor as a senior advisor tried to regain order in the chamber, but Queen Aura raised one slender hand without looking away from the human envoy, and the entire court instantly fell silent again. Then she spoke a sentence so quietly that the translators almost hesitated before carrying the words through the hall. And the question was not about war or territory or the fate of two civilizations standing on the edge of conflict, but about a single forgotten night on a frozen world. She asked him if he remembered finding a young alien traveler lost in a storm and telling her in a calm voice that she was not alone and that everything would be all right. For a few seconds, Ethan Walker simply stared at the queen, the name of that frozen world echoing quietly in his mind like a door opening somewhere deep in his memory. Carthos 9 had never been important in the grand map of human space. Just a remote research outpost sitting on the edge of a silent system where the temperature rarely climbed above -60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind could carry ice crystals across the plains like drifting sand. He remembered endless white horizons. Under a pale sky, the sound of frozen air scraping against the walls of the station, and long patrols where the only company was the faint hum of a thermal suit and the distant glow of a weak sun struggling through thin clouds. At first the memory felt incomplete, just scattered fragments of a deployment he had nearly forgotten. But then the queen's question sharpened the image until one particular night surfaced clearly in his thoughts. He remembered walking along a ridge outside the perimeter. Sensors, the storm winds strong enough to shake the antenna towers, when the motion scanner had briefly detected something moving beyond the ice fields. The outpost commander had assumed it was drifting debris or wildlife native to the planet. Yet Ethan had stepped outside anyway, more out of curiosity than duty, and he remembered the long hike through swirling snow where visibility dropped to barely 20 yards. After nearly half a mile, he had found a shape half buried against the frozen rocks, a figure far too small to be a vehicle or machine, and when he had knelt beside it, he had realized it was a young alien traveler wrapped in a thin environmental cloak that had already begun to fail against the brutal cold. Ethan could still recall the way the stranger had looked up at him with wide, luminous eyes that reflected the pale storm light, clearly expecting hostility or abandonment. Because Carthos 9 was far from any official trade routes, and strangers rarely survived long in its climate, he had not known who she was, and he had certainly not known She belonged to a royal bloodline. To him, she had simply looked like someone who was very far from home and dangerously close to freezing in a place where rescue ships did not arrive quickly. He had offered the only thing he had available, the thermal blanket from his field pack and the calm reassurance of a voice trained to keep frightened civilians steady during evacuations, telling her slowly that the storm would pass and that the outpost would keep her warm until transport could be arranged. Back in the throne hall, Ethan felt the memory settle fully into place, and he finally answered the Queen with quiet honesty, explaining that he did remember finding a stranded traveler during a storm years ago, but that he had never learned her name and had assumed she was simply a civilian whose navigation system had failed near the research zone. The court remained silent as the human envoy spoke. The vast chamber filled only with the distant hum of the palace energy grid and the faint shifting of alien robes along the marble floor. Queen Ara listened without interruption, and when Ethan finished, she took one final step down from the platform until the distance between them was no longer that of ruler and diplomat, but of two individuals standing in the same room, sharing the same memory. Her golden eyes softened with something that looked almost like quiet gratitude, and she said slowly, with a calm that carried far more weight than any command, that the lost traveler from that frozen storm had never forgotten the human voice that had told her she was not alone. The words settled over the throne hall with a weight that no official declaration could have carried, and for a long moment Ethan Walker simply stood there trying to reconcile the quiet memory of a stranded traveler with the towering figure of the Queen, now standing only 20 feet away from him. The vast chamber felt different suddenly, as if the polished marble floor and crystal pillars had shifted from the setting of a tense diplomatic standoff into the stage of a story that neither side had expected to revisit. Ethan could still remember the storm on Carthos 9 as clearly as the cold air against his face, the sharp wind driving frozen dust across the plains, and the way the small alien figure had struggled to remain conscious while the temperature outside the outpost dropped well below -70 degrees Fahrenheit. He had not thought of it as a rescue at the time because soldiers on remote assignments were trained to help whoever they found beyond the perimeter sensors, whether it was a stranded cargo pilot or a lost research technician. And the stranger had spoken very little that night as the medical staff wrapped her in heated blankets inside the outpost infirmary. What he remembered most clearly was the quiet moment before the evacuation transport arrived, when she had asked him why a human would bother searching the storm for someone who might have been an enemy, and Ethan had answered with the same simple honesty he had used his entire career, explaining that sometimes a person was just another person in need of help, regardless of what flag or species they belonged to. Now the same voice that had spoken those words years ago echoed softly through the alien throne hall as he tried to understand how that forgotten encounter had followed him across the stars. The Queen descended the final step of the platform, and the distance between them closed to little more than 10 feet, close enough that Ethan could see faint patterns of silver light shifting across her cobalt skin as the palace illumination reflected from the crystalline walls. The alien advisors lining the chamber looked visibly unsettled by the situation because rulers of the Solarian Dominion rarely approached foreign envoys so closely without ceremony or security protocols. Yet none of them dared interrupt, as Queen Ara studied the human before her with the quiet focus of someone confirming a truth she had carried alone for many years. Her voice came again, calm but far warmer than before, and she told him that the traveler he had found on Carthos 9 had not been a civilian at all but a young heir traveling in secrecy through the frontier systems during a period of internal uncertainty within the Dominion. Her vessel had experienced a navigation failure during a violent magnetic storm, and she had been forced to land on the frozen surface of a world she had never planned to visit. She admitted that when she first saw the human soldier approaching through the swirling ice, she had expected suspicion or hostility, because stories about humanity within the Dominion had often described them as unpredictable newcomers expanding quickly through the galaxy. Instead, she had heard a calm voice through the storm telling her that everything would be all right and that she was safe now. Ethan listened quietly as the memory completed itself in ways he had never imagined, realizing that the frightened traveler he had guided back to the research outpost had eventually returned to her people and become the ruler now standing before him. A ripple of Disbelief moved through the alien court as the implication spread across the chamber, and one of the senior commanders stepped forward as if to question the Queen's decision to share such a personal history during a diplomatic confrontation. Queen Alara raised her hand gently, and the commander stopped at once. And when she turned back toward Ethan, her expression held a calm clarity that replaced the earlier tensions surrounding the negotiation. She said that the voice she had heard in the storm all those years ago had stayed with her longer than any political lesson or military training, because it had been the first time someone from another species had spoken to her without fear or expectation. Then she asked a question that no one in the chamber had anticipated, asking the human envoy whether he had come to her throne world only to deliver a message from Earth, or whether the same voice that had once helped a lost traveler stand against a storm still believed that two civilizations could choose something better than war. The question hung in the immense throne hall like a fragile bridge between two worlds, and Ethan Walker felt the weight of every eye in the chamber settle on him as he considered his answer. The polished marble beneath his boots reflected the pale glow of the palace lights, while the distant stars above the transparent ceiling drifted slowly across the night sky of Alara Prime, reminding him how small one human voice should have felt inside the capital of an empire that spanned dozens of systems. Yet the Queen was standing only a few steps away now, no longer elevated on the towering throne, but on the same floor as the envoy she had once met during a storm on a forgotten frontier world. Ethan inhaled slowly, and the cool air carried a faint metallic scent mixed with something sweet from the alien gardens beyond the palace walls, a quiet reminder that despite the tension filling the chamber, this place was still meant to be a center of life and culture rather than a battlefield of politics. He answered the Queen with the same steady tone he had used years earlier on Carthos 9, explaining that he had indeed been sent by Earth to deliver a message, but that the message itself was not complicated or strategic. He told her that humanity had grown quickly among the stars, and that rapid growth often made other civilizations uneasy. Yet the people who had sent him here believed that curiosity and cooperation would build a stronger future than suspicion ever could. He admitted openly that he did not possess the authority to command fleets or redraw borders, but that he had been chosen precisely because he believed peace was more than a negotiation tactic. As his voice carried across the hall, the rows of alien advisors remained silent, their luminous eyes reflecting the palace lights while they listened. To a human describes something rarely spoken in imperial chambers. Queen Alara watched him carefully, and when he finished, she did not immediately respond. Instead, turning slightly, as if looking beyond the great hall toward the distant horizon of her world. For a moment, the quiet presence of the throne hall returned, the soft hum of energy fields beneath the floor, and the distant murmur of wind brushing the upper towers of the palace. Then the Queen spoke again, and her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had spent years learning to balance duty with memory. She said that rulers were trained to weigh decisions in terms of territory, alliances, and survival, but that sometimes the most important moments in a civilization's history began with something far smaller and more personal. She reminded the court that the Dominion had once believed humanity to be unpredictable newcomers whose ambitions might threaten the balance of the region. Yet the story she had just shared proved that even a simple act of kindness between strangers could shape the course of future choices. A ripple of quiet discussion moved through the chamber, but no one interrupted her as she returned her gaze to Ethan. She said that the voice he carried had once helped a lost traveler stand against a storm on a frozen world, and that today it stood once again in the center of another storm, this time not of wind and ice, but of fear between two civilizations. Then she asked him one final question, not as a ruler testing an envoy, but as the same traveler who had once followed a human soldier back through a field of blowing snow, asking whether he truly believed that trust between species could begin with something as simple as one person choosing to help another when no one else was watching. The Queen's question lingered in the vast throne hall like the final note of a quiet song, and Ethan Walker felt the attention of an entire alien empire resting on the answer he was about to give. The chamber remained still, the towering crystal pillars reflecting pale light across the marble floor, while distant stars drifted slowly beyond the transparent ceiling far above them. And for a moment Ethan remembered again the endless ice fields of Carthos 9, where the wind had carried frozen dust. across the landscape like white smoke under a weak sun. That night had never felt important at the time because soldiers on remote assignments learned quickly that most acts of help were small and temporary. Yet now that forgotten moment had somehow followed him across 8 years and dozens of star systems to the center of the Solarian Dominion. He met Queen Aura's gaze calmly and answered with the same quiet honesty that had guided him through years of service, telling her that trust rarely began with grand declarations or treaties signed under bright lights, but with small choices that people made when there was no audience and no reward. He explained that on the frontier a person survived by relying on strangers as often as friends, because the universe was too vast and too unpredictable for anyone to face it alone. The words carried gently through the chamber, and several alien advisors shifted uneasily, as if the simplicity of the idea felt unfamiliar within the structure of imperial politics. Ethan continued, saying that he believed civilizations worked the same way as individuals. That cooperation began when someone decided to treat another being as a neighbor rather than a threat. He admitted that humans were still learning how to live among the stars, and that mistakes would happen along the way, but he believed those mistakes did not need to lead to fear or conflict if both sides were willing to listen. The quiet hum of the palace systems filled the pause that followed, and Queen Aura watched him with an expression that held both curiosity and reflection, as though measuring not only the human envoy before her, but the larger meaning behind the path that had brought him there. Slowly she turned toward the rows of advisors lining the hall, and the movement immediately drew their attention because rulers of the Dominion rarely shared personal judgment in front of the full court without careful preparation. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber as she reminded them that the Dominion had always valued knowledge and long memory, and that sometimes history was shaped not by fleets or negotiations, but by moments that revealed the character of those involved. She spoke of the frozen storm on Carthos 9, and the human voice that had reached her through the wind when she had been far from home and uncertain whether anyone would help. A ripple of quiet realization spread through the gathered officials as they understood that the ruler of their empire had once been the same lost traveler the human envoy had described. When she turned back to Ethan, the earlier tension had softened into a thoughtful calm, and she told him that leaders were taught to expect strategy in every word spoken by an envoy. Yet his answers contained something far less calculated. She said that the Dominion had prepared for a negotiation filled with demands and warnings, but instead they had heard a human speak about trust as if it were the most natural force in the universe. Then Queen Alara took another slow step closer and asked him one more question, her voice steady yet quietly searching, asking whether the same human who had once guided a stranger through a blizzard would still choose to offer that same simple trust now that the fate of two civilizations might depend on it. The Queen's final question seemed to narrow the enormous throne hall into a single quiet moment, and Ethan Walker felt the gravity of it settle on his shoulders more heavily than any armor he had worn during his years as a Marine. The vast chamber remained silent except for the soft hum of energy systems beneath the marble floor and the distant whisper of wind brushing the outer towers of the palace high above them. He could sense the attention of the alien court watching carefully, hundreds of observers from across the Dominion measuring not only his answer, but the intentions of the species he represented. Ethan took a slow breath and allowed the memory of Carthos 9 to settle clearly in his thoughts once again. The frozen plains stretching for miles beneath a pale sun, the storm winds carrying ice crystals across the ground like drifting smoke, and the fragile figure of a traveler who had believed she might not survive the night. He remembered that he had not thought about diplomacy or strategy when he offered help that day because the decision had been simple at the time. Someone had needed assistance, and he had been close enough to give it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same steady calm that had guided that moment years earlier. He told Queen Alara that trust was never easy and that offering it carried risk for any civilization that had grown strong enough to protect itself. However, he believed the greater risk came from assuming that every unknown neighbor would eventually become an enemy. He explained that humanity had learned something important during its first century among the stars, that exploration often revealed not only strange planets and new technologies, but also reflections of familiar hopes and fears in other species. The Dominion and Earth were different cultures with different histories, yet the fact that they could stand in the same room and speak across that difference meant there was already something worth protecting. Ethan paused for a moment and allowed his gaze to move across the rows of alien advisors who had gathered in the hall, noticing how many of them watched with quiet curiosity rather than hostility. Then he returned his attention to the Queen and answered her question plainly, saying that yes, he would still choose to offer trust even now when the stakes were far larger than a storm on a distant frontier world. Because if two civilizations could not risk that first step toward understanding, then no treaty would ever truly last. The words carried gently through the chamber, and for several seconds no one moved. Queen Aura studied him in silence, as if searching for any hint of calculation behind the human's calm sincerity, yet what she saw seemed only to deepen the thoughtful expression in her golden eyes. She turned slightly toward the assembled court, and the movement immediately drew their focus. Her voice rose once more with the calm authority that had guided the Dominion for many years, yet now it carried a tone of reflection that few in the chamber had heard before. She said that leaders were trained to weigh strength and caution in every decision, yet wisdom sometimes arrived from unexpected directions. The humans standing before them had not attempted to manipulate history or demand gratitude for an old kindness. Instead, he had spoken about trust, as though it were something both civilizations could still choose. When she looked back at Ethan, her gaze held the quiet recognition of someone who had already begun to reach a conclusion. And in that moment, the advisors of the Dominion realized that the fate of the coming negotiations might no longer depend on fleets or power, but on a memory carried through a storm and a voice that had once told a frightened traveler she was not alone. The quiet that followed Ethan Walker's answer did not feel empty, but heavy with thought. And in the immense throne hall of the Solarian Dominion, that silence carried more meaning than any immediate reply. Queen Alara remained standing only a few steps from the human envoy, while the light from the crystal ceiling above reflected softly across the polished floor, turning the chamber into a field of pale silver where every movement seemed deliberate and measured. The rows of alien advisors watched closely as their ruler considered the humans' words, and Ethan could sense that the moment had shifted from confrontation to something far more uncertain, a crossroads where pride, memory, and the future of two civilizations now intersected. The Queen slowly turned toward the assembled court, and her gaze moved across the commanders, diplomats, and scholars who had gathered to witness what many of them had expected would be a tense negotiation filled with warnings and political calculation. Instead, they had listened to a human speak with simple honesty about trust, a concept that sounded strangely fragile when placed beside the vast fleets and strategic alliances that usually defined interstellar diplomacy. Queen Aura raised her hand slightly, and the soft murmurs among the advisors faded at once, replaced by the respectful stillness that followed every gesture of their ruler. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the hall, calm yet thoughtful, as she reminded the court that the Dominion had thrived for centuries because it valued knowledge and long memory above impulsive reaction. She said that history had taught their people that fear often disguised itself as caution, and that the wisest leaders were those who recognized the difference. Her golden eyes briefly returned to Ethan before sweeping once more across the chamber as she explained that the human envoy standing before them had not arrived with threats or demands, but with the same quiet conviction he had shown years earlier on a frozen frontier world. That conviction had once helped a lost traveler survive a storm, and today it had reminded her that the strength of a civilization was measured not only by its fleets, but by the character of the individuals who represented it. The advisors listened carefully, and several exchanged thoughtful glances. Because such reflections were rarely spoken so openly within the formal setting of imperial court, Ethan remained still while the Queen continued, explaining that the Dominion had prepared for the possibility of conflict with humanity, because rapid expansion often unsettled established powers. Yet the encounter unfolding before them suggested another path might exist. She turned back toward the human envoy and stepped slightly closer, the distance between them now small enough that their conversation no longer needed the full amplification of the palace translators. Her voice softened as she addressed him directly and said that the Dominion could not decide the fate of two civilizations based solely on an old memory. yet it could choose whether to treat that memory as a warning or an opportunity. She asked Ethan if he understood what it meant for a ruler to reconsider a course that many powerful voices within her empire believed was necessary. Ethan met her gaze calmly and answered that leadership often required courage not only in moments of battle, but in moments of restraint, because choosing patience when fear demanded action was sometimes the harder path. The queen listened to his words, and for a brief moment her expression reflected the same thoughtful calm she had carried years earlier, while sitting beside a heater in a remote outpost infirmary waiting for the storm outside to fade. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried just enough volume for the entire court to hear, and she announced that before any decision about war or peace would be made, the Dominion would hear the full proposal of the human envoy, because a voice that had once guided someone through a storm deserved to be heard clearly when the future of many worlds stood uncertain before them. The Queen's declaration carried across the throne hall with calm authority, and the effect was immediate as the quiet tension among the assembled advisors shifted into focused attention. Ethan Walker felt the weight of the moment settle around him, like the still air before the first light of dawn, and he realized that the fragile opening created by memory and trust had given him something far more valuable than a negotiation advantage. It had given him the chance to be heard. Queen Elira stepped back slightly, allowing the human envoy the center of the chamber, and the movement itself sent a ripple through the court, because such symbolic gestures were rarely granted to representatives of newly arrived civilizations. The polished marble beneath Ethan's boots reflected the distant stars visible through the high crystal ceiling, and he took a steady breath, remembering the quiet discipline he had learned during years of service in remote outposts where patience often mattered more than strength. He began speaking slowly so that the translator drones hovering along the chamber walls could carry his words clearly to every corner of the immense hall. He explained that humanity had expanded across several nearby systems in a relatively short span of time, and that this rapid growth had understandably caused concern among older civilizations who had spent centuries building stable alliances and careful borders. However, he emphasized that the expansion of human settlements had never been driven by conquest, but by exploration and the desire to build new homes among the stars. Ethan described how Earth's early history had taught painful lessons about the cost of misunderstanding between cultures and how those lessons had shaped the values of the people now reaching beyond their home world. He said that the proposal he carried was not a demand for territory or resources, but an invitation to cooperation in areas that would benefit both civilizations, including scientific research and frontier systems, shared navigation networks that could make dangerous regions of space safer for travelers, and cultural exchanges that would allow both species to learn directly from one another rather than relying on rumors or distant reports. The advisors listened carefully as the translation echoes moved through the chamber, and Ethan noticed that several of them had begun recording the speech with small crystalline devices that shimmered faintly in the palace light. He continued by explaining that peace between civilizations was rarely built on a single agreement, but on a pattern of choices repeated over time, small steps of trust that gradually created something stronger than suspicion. He admitted openly that humanity did not expect the Dominion to change its policies overnight or to ignore legitimate concerns about security, but he believed both sides could begin with limited partnerships that allowed trust to grow naturally rather than forcing immediate commitments. While he spoke, Queen Elira watched him with quiet concentration, and there was something thoughtful in her expression, as if she were listening not only to the proposal itself, but to the deeper tone behind it. When Ethan finally paused, the hall remained silent for several seconds, the kind of silence that suggested careful consideration rather than uncertainty. The queen slowly stepped forward again, and her gaze moved across the gathered advisors before returning to the human envoy. She said that the Dominion had long believed that strength required preparing for conflict whenever new powers emerged in the region, yet the proposal they had just heard suggested another possibility, one in which knowledge and cooperation might offer greater stability than fear. The advisors exchanged measured looks as her words settled across the chamber, because they understood that the ruler of their empire was now openly weighing two different futures. Queen Elira then turned fully toward Ethan Walker and said that the voice which had once guided her through a storm on a frozen world had now presented a path that could guide two civilizations away from a far larger storm, and she asked the court to consider whether the courage to explore the unknown might be the very quality that both species shared. The throne hall remained quiet after the queen's words, yet the silence now carried a different tone than before, less like tension and more like the careful turning of thoughts among those who had come expecting confrontation but had instead witnessed something unexpected unfold before them. Ethan Walker stood calmly at the center of the vast chamber, while the reflections of distant stars drifted slowly across the crystal ceiling above, and he could feel that the moment had moved beyond a simple diplomatic exchange into something deeper, a test of whether memory and trust could influence decisions normally shaped by strategy and caution. Queen Alara remained only a few steps away from him, and the thoughtful expression in her golden eyes suggested that she was measuring not only the proposal he had presented, but also the reaction of the advisors who surrounded them. Several senior members of the Dominion court stepped forward slightly, their long ceremonial robes catching the pale palace light as they prepared to speak, and one elder scholar addressed the queen with a tone of respectful concern, explaining that while the human envoy's proposal sounded promising, it also represented a significant departure from the Dominion's long-standing approach to newly emerging powers in the region. The scholar reminded the court that stability had been maintained for centuries through careful observation and gradual contact, not through immediate partnerships with civilizations whose future direction was still uncertain. The words echoed across the chamber, and Ethan listened quietly because he understood the hesitation behind them. Exploration had taught humanity that trust always developed slowly between cultures that had never shared history before. Queen Ura listened without interruption, and when the scholar finished, she acknowledged the concern with a slight nod, saying that caution had indeed protected the Dominion for many generations, yet wisdom also required recognizing moments when a familiar strategy might no longer be the only path forward. She explained that the arrival of humanity had already begun to change the balance of exploration in nearby sectors of space, and that ignoring this reality would not make it disappear. Instead, it might simply push both civilizations toward misunderstanding. Her gaze moved briefly toward Ethan as she continued, saying that the Dominion could choose to view humanity's curiosity as a potential threat, or as an opportunity to build a partnership that might benefit both sides of the expanding frontier. Another advisor stepped forward, this one a senior navigator responsible for monitoring deep space travel routes, and he admitted that human exploration vessels had already mapped several hazardous corridors that Dominion ships had long avoided due to incomplete data. Cooperation in that area alone could improve safety for travelers from many worlds. The discussion slowly expanded as different voices in the chamber offered perspectives shaped by their fields of expertise, and Ethan realized that the court was no longer debating whether to reject the proposal outright, but rather how cautiously they might consider its possibilities. Through it all, Queen Alara remained calm and attentive, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally before raising her hand once more to restore quiet order. When the chamber settled, she turned toward Ethan again and spoke with steady clarity, saying that the Dominion would not make decisions based on emotion alone, yet it would also not ignore a rare opportunity when one appeared before them. She announced that a council of advisors would review the human proposal in detail over the coming cycles, and that representatives from both civilizations would be invited to participate in that discussion. Her final words carried across the hall with quiet authority as she explained that the voice which had once guided her through a storm had now opened a conversation that might guide two civilizations toward a future neither of them had fully imagined yet. The decision announced by Queen Ura slowly settled across the throne hall, and the gathered advisors began to withdraw into quieter conversations, while ceremonial aides moved gracefully along the edges of the chamber, their presence subtle yet purposeful as they prepared the palace for the next stage of discussion. Ethan Walker remained where he stood for a moment longer, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in, because he understood that what had just happened was far more significant than the simple scheduling of a council review. The atmosphere that had greeted him when he first entered the hall had carried the sharp tension of two civilizations preparing for confrontation. Yet now that tension had softened into something far more complex, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and the quiet realization that a different path might be possible. Queen Elura observed the movement of her court with calm composure before turning once more toward the human envoy who had unexpectedly shifted the tone of the entire gathering. She descended the final steps of the platform entirely and walked across the marble floor until she stood beside him rather than above him. A gesture so subtle, yet so meaningful that several advisors paused their conversations to watch. The queen's voice was softer now, meant more for him than for the entire chamber, and she told him that few envoys arrived at the Dominion court carrying nothing but sincerity and a memory from the past. She explained that leaders often expected diplomacy to be a careful exchange of leverage and advantage, yet the path he had opened relied on something more difficult to measure. Ethan listened quietly, noticing how the enormous hall now felt less like an arena and more like a place where two individuals could speak openly despite the audience surrounding them. He replied that the people of Earth had not sent him because he was the most powerful diplomat available, but because they believed he would speak honestly even when the situation felt uncertain. He admitted that he could not guarantee the future would unfold perfectly between their civilizations, yet he believed that honest conversation was the only place where understanding could begin. Queen Elura studied him for a moment longer, and there was a faint reflection of old memory in her expression, the same thoughtful calm she had once carried while sitting inside a small outpost shelter on a frozen world. She told him that when she had returned to her people years earlier, she had carried with her a quiet question about humanity, wondering whether the kindness she had encountered during that storm had been an unusual exception or a glimpse of something deeper within the species. Today, she said she had finally heard the answer in his voice. Around them, the court gradually resumed its formal rhythm as aides guided advisors toward smaller chambers where the coming council discussions would take place. The great hall slowly emptied until the immense space echoed softly, with distant footsteps and the faint hum of palace systems. Ethan glanced toward the towering windows where the lights of the alien capital stretched across the horizon like a sea of stars, and he realized that the true work of diplomacy had only just begun. Beside him, Queen Elura followed his gaze toward the city beyond the palace walls and spoke quietly, saying that the storm which had once brought them together had been made of wind and ice, but the one facing their civilizations now was made of uncertainty and expectation. Then she added that perhaps the same voice, which had once helped someone find their way through darkness, might help guide both of their peoples through this new moment as well. The great throne hall had grown quieter as the formal court dispersed into smaller chambers throughout the palace, leaving the vast space filled only with the soft resonance of distant footsteps and the quiet hum of energy flowing through the ancient structure. Ethan Walker remained near the center of the chamber beside Queen Elura while the enormous windows above the city reflected thousands of lights stretching across the alien capital like constellations brought down to the surface of the world. From this height the city seemed calm and endless, its towers rising gracefully into the evening sky of Elira Prime. And for a moment Ethan was reminded of the first time he had looked down at Earth from orbit during his early military career, realizing how fragile even the most powerful civilizations could appear when seen from a distance. Queen Elura watched the same horizon with a thoughtful expression, her golden eyes reflecting the distant glow of the city while the silence between them carried the quiet understanding that their conversation had begun something far larger than either of them alone. She finally spoke in a calm voice that carried easily through the nearly empty hall and said that the Dominion had spent centuries believing that strength meant preparing for every possible threat beyond its borders. That belief had guided their expansion, protected their citizens, and shaped the way they viewed younger civilizations entering the wider galactic community. Yet the encounter unfolding today had reminded her that strength could also take another form, one built from patience and the willingness to listen before deciding what the future should hold. Ethan listened respectfully and replied that humanity had faced similar lessons during its own history, learning that the unknown could inspire fear but also wonder depending on how people chose to approach it. He explained that when humans first looked toward the stars they did not know whether they would find rivals or partners among the countless worlds beyond their own system. Yet they had chosen to explore anyway because curiosity had always been one of the strongest forces guiding their species. Queen Aura nodded slightly, as if recognizing that familiar impulse, and she told him that curiosity had once driven her own journey to the frontier systems long before she had expected to inherit the responsibility of ruling an empire. The memory of that younger traveler seemed to pass quietly through her thoughts, and she admitted that if the storm on Carthos 9 had ended differently, she might never have returned home to shape the future of her people. Ethan considered this for a moment, and said that perhaps the most important events in history were often the smallest at the time, moments when someone chose compassion instead of suspicion or patience instead of fear. The Queen regarded him with a calm intensity that suggested she understood the meaning behind his words, and she told him that the council discussions beginning in the coming cycles would not be simple because many voices within the Dominion still believed caution demanded distance from humanity's rapid expansion. However, she also believed that the possibility of cooperation deserved genuine consideration because the galaxy was changing and civilizations that refused to adapt risked isolating themselves from opportunities that might benefit everyone. The distant lights of the city shimmered softly through the palace windows as their conversation continued, and Ethan realized that the future relationship between their peoples might depend not on a single speech or agreement, but on the continued willingness of both sides to speak honestly in moments like this. Queen Aura finally turned away from the horizon and looked directly at him once more before saying that the storm which had once brought them together had been a matter of survival, but the one facing them now was a matter of choice. And she hoped that when the council gathered again, both civilizations would remember that even the largest journeys between stars often began with the quiet decision of two strangers choosing to trust each other. The lights of Elara Prime shimmered across the horizon like a living constellation as the night deepened beyond the crystal windows of the palace. And in the vast quiet of the throne hall, Ethan Walker realized that the moment unfolding around him would likely be remembered long after the council meetings and official agreements had faded into history. Beside him, Queen Elara stood with the composed stillness of a ruler accustomed to carrying the weight of countless decisions. Yet there was something different in the atmosphere now, something calmer and more reflective than the tension that had filled the chamber when he first arrived. The immense hall that had once held rows of advisors and commanders now echoed softly, with only distant movement from palace staff preparing the chambers where the Dominion Council would soon begin its careful deliberations. Ethan looked once more toward the enormous windows where the city spread out beneath the evening sky, thousands of glowing structures connected by quiet streams of moving light, and he thought about how similar that distant view felt to looking at Earth from orbit, a reminder that even civilizations separated by species and distance shared the same fragile place among the stars. Queen Elara followed his gaze for a moment before speaking again, her voice calm and thoughtful as she said that rulers often spent their lives studying maps of star systems and trade routes, while rarely considering how small individual choices could redirect the course of history. She admitted that when she had first heard reports about humanity expanding across nearby sectors, she had expected the arrival of another ambitious power determined to prove itself through competition and rivalry. Instead, she had found herself listening to the same voice that had once reached her through the howling winds of a frozen world, a voice that carried the simple certainty that helping another being was reason enough to act. Ethan smiled slightly at that memory and replied that he had never imagined the traveler he helped during that storm would someday become the ruler of an interstellar civilization. To him, she had simply been someone lost in dangerous weather, and the decision to help had felt as natural as breathing. The Queen regarded him with a thoughtful warmth that had slowly replaced the formal distance between them, and she said that perhaps that was exactly what made humanity so difficult for other civilizations to predict, because humans often acted according to principles that could not easily be measured by strategy or power. The distant city lights shimmered quietly as the conversation settled into a reflective pause, and Ethan felt the strange sense that the storm they had spoken about earlier had already begun to clear, leaving open sky where tension had once gathered. Queen Elara finally turned toward him and said that when the Dominion Council met in the coming days they would debate policies, review reports, and measure the risks of every possible decision. Yet she suspected that many of them would remember the story of a storm on Carthos 9 and the human who had offered help without knowing who stood before him. She added softly that sometimes the future of entire civilizations began not with fleets or declarations, but with a single moment of kindness that refused to be forgotten. Ethan nodded in quiet agreement and looked once more toward the stars beyond the palace ceiling, understanding that the journey ahead for their two peoples would still require patience and courage, yet also realizing that the first step had already been taken long ago on a lonely frozen world where two strangers had met in the middle of a storm and chosen trust instead of fear.